Are we born this way? The psychology of inherited traits. Stop blaming yourself for everything. Some of the things you hate most about yourself, you never had a choice in them. Your anxiety, your temper, even the way you react when someone criticizes you. Science shows that up to 50% of your personality was decided before you could even speak. But here's the part nobody talks about. Knowing which traits you inherited and which ones you developed changes everything. Look, we've all heard the whole nature versus nurture debate. But what if I told you it's not actually a debate anymore? Scientists have been studying twins, families, and even strangers for decades, and what they found is pretty wild. Today, we're going to break down exactly what you got from your parents, what you picked up along the way, and most importantly, what you can actually change about yourself. Because understanding this stuff, it's like getting the instruction manual to your own brain that you never knew existed. Here's where things get uncomfortable. Think about the last time you got really angry. Maybe someone cut you off in traffic or a friend said something that set you off. You probably felt bad about it afterward, right? You might have even thought, why am I like this? Why can't I just stay calm like other people? Or maybe it's not anger. Maybe it's anxiety. You walk into a room full of people and your heart starts racing. Your palms get sweaty. Everyone else seems fine, but you're fighting the urge to leave. And you wonder what's wrong with you. Here's the thing that messes with people's heads. We grow up believing we're in complete control. We think if we just try hard enough, we can be whoever we want to be. Society tells us that all the time. Just think positive. Just work on yourself. Just choose to be better. But what if that's not entirely true? What if some parts of you were set in stone before you were even born? And what does that mean for personal responsibility, for self-improvement, for all those times you beat yourself up for not being different? This is the question that keeps psychologists up at night. Because if we're born a certain way, where does that leave free will? Where does that leave growth? And how are we supposed to know which parts of ourselves we can change and which ones we just have to accept? Let's start with the science, but I promise to keep it simple. Back in the 1970s and 80s, researchers started doing these massive twin studies. They would find identical twins who were separated at birth and raised in completely different families. These twins had the same DNA, but totally different environments. And when they studied these twins as adults, they found something shocking. These twins, who had never met each other, would have the same laugh, they'd have similar jobs, they'd name their dogs the same thing. One famous case involved two twins who both became firefighters, married women with the same name, and even took vacations to the same beach in Florida. Neither of them knew the other existed. But here's where it gets tricky, and this is super important. Heritable doesn't mean unchangeable. Let's use an example. Say you inherited a tendency toward anxiety. Your brain is just wired to be more alert to threats. That's your genetic baseline. But whether you actually develop an anxiety disorder depends on what happens to you. If you grow up in a safe, stable environment with parents who teach you coping skills, you might never develop clinical anxiety. But if you grow up in chaos, with trauma, or constant stress, those genetic tendencies get activated. Scientists call this gene-environment interaction. Your genes load the gun, but your environment pulls the trigger. And it goes even deeper. There's this whole field now called epigenetics. This is where your experiences can actually change how your genes work. Not the genes themselves, but whether they're turned on or off. There was this famous study done on rats. They took baby rats and had some mothers who were really attentive, always grooming and caring for their babies. Other mothers were more neglectful. The babies who got more care actually had chemical changes happen to their DNA. Specifically, genes related to stress response got modified. These babies grew up to be calmer, less anxious rats. The babies who didn't get that care grew up more anxious and reactive. The crazy part? These changes could be passed down to the next generation. The babies of the calm rats also tended to be calm, even if they were raised by different mothers. Now, humans are way more complex than rats, but we're seeing similar patterns. Studies on humans who survived famines or major trauma show that their children and even grandchildren can inherit these epigenetic changes. If your grandmother lived through a famine, it might affect your metabolism today. This stuff is both fascinating and kinda terrifying. Let's talk about some specific inherited traits that affect your daily life. Your sleep patterns? About 40 to 50% genetic. If you're a night owl, that's probably inherited. Your body's internal clock, called your circadian rhythm, is controlled by specific genes. Some people have a genetic mutation that makes them natural early birds. Others have variations that make them night owls. You can force yourself to wake up early, but you're fighting against your biology. Your taste preferences? Genetics play a huge role. There's a gene called TAS238 that determines whether you can taste bitter compounds. About 25% of people are super tasters who find bitter foods unbearable. Another 25% are non-tasters who can't taste bitterness at all. The rest of us are somewhere in between. This is why some people hate vegetables like broccoli or Brussels sprouts. They're not being picky. They literally taste different chemicals than you do. Your athletic ability? Studies suggest that's about 50 to 70% heritable. There's a gene called ACTN3 that affects muscle composition. Some variants give you more fast-twitch muscle fibers, which are great for sprinting and power. Other variants give you more slow-twitch fibers, better for endurance. Elite sprinters almost all have the sprint variant. Elite marathon runners tend to have the endurance variant. Even your risk-taking behavior has genetic components. There's a gene that affects dopamine receptors in your brain. Some variants make you crave more intense experiences to feel satisfaction. People with these variants are more likely to try extreme sports, experiment with substances, or take financial risks. Your empathy and emotional sensitivity? Also partly genetic. Scientists have found specific genes that affect oxytocin and vasopressin, hormones involved in bonding and empathy. Some people are literally wired to be more emotionally attuned to others. Now, here's where people start getting uncomfortable. Because if all this stuff is genetic, what does that mean for things like criminal behavior, addiction, success in life? This is where we need to be really careful. Yes, there are genetic factors that increase risk for things like addiction or aggressive behavior, but genes are not destiny. Take addiction. There's definitely a genetic component, probably around 40 to 60% heritability depending on the substance. If your parent is an alcoholic, your risk is higher. But most people with that genetic risk never develop addiction. Why? Because they either never try the substance, or they have protective factors in their environment, or they develop good coping skills.
Criminal behavior is similar. There are genes associated with impulsivity and aggression, but the vast majority of people with these genes never commit crimes. The difference usually comes down to environment, things like poverty, trauma, lack of education, or exposure to violence. This is why the whole nature versus nurture thing is a false choice. It's always both. Always. Your genes set the range of possibilities, but your experiences determine where you land in that range. Let me give you a personal example that might help this make sense. Let's say someone has genes that make them predisposed to being anxious and introverted. In one life, they grow up with pushy parents who force them into constant social situations and criticize them for being shy. They might develop social anxiety disorder, depression, and really low self-esteem. In another life, they grow up with understanding parents who respect their need for alone time but gently encourage them to try new things. They might become a successful writer or programmer who's perfectly happy with a small circle of close friends. Same genes, totally different outcomes. The research on happiness is really interesting too. Studies suggest that your baseline level of happiness is about 50% genetic. There's something called the set point theory, which says we all have a natural level of happiness we tend to return to, no matter what happens. Lottery winners and people who become paralyzed both tend to return to their baseline happiness level within a year or two. But that other 50%, that's where you have control. Your choices, your relationships, your mindset, all of that matters. So here's the big realization that changes everything. You're not a blank slate, but you're not a prisoner either. Think about it like this. You were dealt a hand of cards when you were born. Some people got really good cards, genes for intelligence, emotional stability, good health, maybe even good looks. Other people got dealt a tougher hand, genes that make life harder in various ways. But here's what matters. You still have to play the hand you were dealt, and how you play those cards makes all the difference. Knowing your genetic tendencies isn't an excuse. It's information. It's power. If you know you have a genetic tendency toward anxiety, you can learn that your brain is just wired to be more alert. It doesn't mean something's wrong with you. It means you need to learn specific skills to manage that tendency. Maybe therapy, maybe medication, maybe meditation or exercise. You're not broken, you're just working with different hardware. If you know you're genetically an introvert, you can stop trying to force yourself to be the life of the party. You can build a life that honors your need for quiet and deep connections instead of shallow socializing. You can be successful and happy as an introvert. If you know you have genetic risk factors for addiction, you can be more careful about substance use. You can build strong support systems. You can learn healthy coping mechanisms before you need them. This is what psychologists call gene-informed intervention. It's using genetic knowledge to make better choices about your life. And here's something that blew my mind when I learned it. There was a study where they told some people that willpower is genetic and limited. They told other people that willpower is like a muscle you can build. The people who were told it's genetic gave up faster on difficult tasks. But here's the twist. When they told people, yes, willpower has genetic components, but understanding your personal tendencies helps you work with them instead of against them, those people did better than both other groups. It's not about determinism or free will, it's about self-awareness leading to better strategies. Look, the science is clear. You inherited a lot more than you probably realize. Your personality, your intelligence, your mental health risks, even your taste in food. There's a genetic component to almost everything. But that's not the end of the story. It's just the beginning. Because once you understand what you're working with, you can make informed choices. You can stop beating yourself up for things that were never entirely in your control. And you can focus your energy on the things you can actually change. Yes, you were born a certain way, but you also become who you are through every choice, every experience, every relationship, and every challenge you face. The goal isn't to figure out what percentage of you is nature versus nurture. The goal is to understand yourself well enough to build the life that works for you, with the brain and body you actually have, not the one you wish you had. You don't get to choose your starting point, but you absolutely get to choose your direction, and that's what really matters. Some parts of you were decided before you were born. Other parts are still being written. The trick is knowing the difference. If this helped you see yourself differently, subscribe for more videos. Thank you, guys.